Before clocks ticked and radiators hummed, before anyone had invented fleece pajamas or the fine emotional comfort of late-night snacks, winter descended on ancient villages like a slumbering mammoth, cold, heavy, and deeply inconvenient. Imagine it's an especially bleak December evening in Northern Europe, some 2,000 years ago. The sun, lazy and sullen, has already rolled beyond the hills, leaving behind a dim grey hush. Inside a roundhouse, a structure that looks like a particularly enterprising hedgehog designed it, straw roofing, smoke escaping from a hole in the middle, walls made of wattle, daub, and sheer human tenacity. A family begins their nightly winter ritual. Now, to stay warm, the household would have done something refreshingly unmodern. Gone to bed, all of them, at once, in the same room, sometimes even in the same bed. It sounds cheerful until you remember it wasn't an enormous memory foam mattress with fluffy duvets and 17 decorative pillows. It was often a pile of straw, animal skins, and if you were lucky, some sort of lumpy wool blanket that smelled deeply agrarian. These communal sleep arrangements weren't simply born of familial fondness. They were practical. Body heat, after all, is nature's original central heating system. Fathers, mothers, siblings, perhaps the neighbor, if the thatch roof was leaking again. Everyone huddled like spoons in a rustic cutlery drawer. It was warm. It was smelly. It was frankly survivable. Now, you may be wondering, what about that small matter called nutrition? Surely one didn't survive the bitter night on half a parsnip and dreams of roasted pheasants. And you'd be correct. Winter eating was about preservation, both of food and spirit. Salted meats, smoked fish, dried peas, onions, and cabbages that had been buried like treasure in root cellars. These ancient pantries were dark, chilly holes in the ground that held enough food to feed a tiny army or one especially hungry teenager. And porridge. Oh, the porridge. Porridge, my dear listener, was more than just a dish. It was a seasonal companion. Made from humble grains slowly simmered over hearth fires that burned round the clock, it was often served hot and sometimes even twice a day. People spiced it with whatever local herbs they had, or more often didn't, and stretched it out with milk, water, and occasionally culinary optimism. There were no snacks between meals, no midnight cheese escapades. Food was rationed carefully, and dinner was often eaten early, because who wants to cook by candlelight when you've only got one candle? Now let's talk about staying warm. Picture this. You, your family, the goats, and possibly a chicken named Agnes, all tucked inside a small, smoke-blackened room. The hearth sat at the center, crackling steadily. Fire was life, warmth, light, and a means to keep the meat from developing a spirited personality. Getting the fire started in the morning was so crucial that embers were often banked carefully under ash at night, buried like sleeping coals, waiting to be nudged awake with the first cold fingers of dawn. Clothing, if we can call it that, was multi-purpose. No one changed into sleepwear because no one had sleepwear. You simply wore what you had. Layers upon layers of wool, linen, and animal hide. The idea was less about fashion and more about insulation. Underwear was, if it existed at all, a theoretical luxury. Frankly, your undergarments were more like inner garments, just more layers of the same itchy devotion. But winter wasn't all suffering and hay-infused sleepwear. It was also a time of long nights, deep rest, and unexpected coziness. People told stories, sang songs, and carved things into wood they didn't need to be carving. They turned toward each other, not metaphorically, but literally, because only the middle of the bed stayed warm, and as ice tickled the windows and winds pressed against the brittle doorboards, they drifted off to sleep, lulled by the slow flicker of fire and the occasional suspicious thump from the roof, which was probably just snow, not another possum. Eventually, the house fell quiet, the kind of quiet only winter allows, where silence itself feels padded, wrapped in wool, and waiting for spring. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now gather close, settle deep into your blankets, and imagine the fire still crackling softly. The wind outside was the sort that muttered secrets through the cracks in walls. It curled like a lazy cat around wooden beams and stone facades, whispering its chilly gossip to anyone foolish enough not to have sealed their door with a thick woolen curtain, or, barring that, the family goat. Yes, sometimes in the truly ancient winters, the livestock slept inside, not just for company, but as a form of biological central heating. No one talked about it much, but sheep were the original hot water bottles. In the days before space heaters and electric blankets, before even proper chimneys, the world got very creative about warmth, especially at night, when sleeping was less an act of rest and more a trial of survival. Take the Vikings, for instance. These rugged Scandinavians knew how to winter properly. At night, entire families, and sometimes their animals, tucked in together under one long, smoky roof called a langus. Everyone slept along the sides of this structure, bundled in pelts and sharing body heat, like ancient radiator systems fueled by shared breath and mild snoring. The fire pit in the center burned low all through the night, not just for warmth, but also to keep unfriendly spirits and frostbite at bay. The soot-covered rafters overhead told stories too, a silent record of smoke, time, and the fact that no one had invented a chimney yet. They didn't mind. In fact, being constantly sooty seemed like a small price to pay, when the alternative was freezing into a rather handsome Norse popsicle. Meanwhile, south of the fjords and closer to the Mediterranean, winters were, let's be honest, a bit less dramatic, but even Roman villas needed a little help staying cozy when the temperature dipped below toga-friendly levels. Enter the hypocaust, a Roman underfloor heating system so ingenious that it still has modern architects raising their eyebrows in polite envy. The hypocaust was essentially a basement full of hot air. No, not a Senate meeting, that was upstairs, but an actual space beneath the floor where heat from a nearby furnace could circulate. Wealthy Romans had their floors mounted on little pillars, and hot air would waft underneath, warming their toes as they reclined on couches that definitely should not have existed in rooms with open fire hazards. It may sound luxurious, and it was, but someone still had to crawl under there now and then to clean out the soot and ash, making ancient Roman house maintenance a job best suited to those with very short tempers and a willingness to crouch. Yet in many places, people relied on no such architecture, just clever layering, stubbornness, and surprisingly intimate sleeping arrangements. The idea of personal sleeping quarters is rather modern. Back then, bedtime meant something like everyone with a pulse into the pile. There was safety in numbers, and more importantly, there was warmth in them too. A medieval peasant cottage at night might seem romantic to us today, all that candlelight and natural draught, but it was likely full of smells, snores, and spontaneous sneezing fits due to the everything is damp forever phenomenon. Still, they made do. Straw mattresses strewn with herbs like lavender and thyme weren't just for comfort or smell. Herbs helped ward off insects and the general feeling that you might be bedding down in a communal barn, which, on certain nights, you might have been. Even the nobility suffered in cold months, though with slightly fancier tools. Bed curtains, also known as testers, enclosed sleeping areas like lacy fortresses. Heated stones were wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath the blankets, an early prototype of the microwavable beanbag, minus the microwave, of course. Feather beds were prized, though they made getting up in the morning an even more philosophical question than usual. Of course, no matter how sleep was arranged, winter nights taught one equalizing truth. Warmth was everything. Whether it came from a flickering hearth, a bundled sibling, an underfloor cauldron of Roman engineering, or an indoor goat with unexpectedly good snuggle etiquette, people found ways to make the night survivable, and sometimes even cozy. The art of eating during these winters, now that was its own adventure. Because while staying warm was essential, staying fed was its own kind of fuel. And the winter table, sparse though it might have been, had its share of surprises. Especially when the bread could dent a helmet, when winter clutched the ancient world in its frozen fingers, the question plaguing nearly everyone from Mesopotamia to medieval Denmark wasn't, do I have Wi-Fi? It was, quite simply, how do I not freeze to death tonight? Let us drift back, softly, gently, as if sinking into a down comforter stitched with time, to long, long ago, when survival meant more than remembering your reusable shopping bag. Imagine yourself as a humble peasant in the English countryside, somewhere around the 14th century, when wool was a lifestyle, not a fabric option. Your home is what we generously call drafty. The structure is primarily wattle and daub, earthy plaster smeared between sticks, which sounds rustic until you realize that Wynne thinks of it less as a wall and more of a polite suggestion. The roof is thatched, which means it's waterproof, unless it rains sideways. Staying warm at night meant strategies. Layering, for one. Not layers like your favorite hoodie and thermal leggings, but something more along the lines of linen shirt, then tunic, then wool robe, then whatever dry moss, straw, or animal fur you could politely wrestle away from your neighbors or livestock. Many people even slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, perhaps because changing into pajamas implies you're warm enough to take any clothes off at all. Now, beds. The average ancient mattress wasn't stuffed with memory foam or even feathers, unless you were royalty or a very persuasive bird thief. No ordinary folk slept starkly and stiffly upon sacks filled with straw or rushes. These inns of your own bedroom were called pallias, which is French for poke your ribs through the night. Over time, people might upgrade to softer fillers like pea shucks or feathers, provided they had peas, ducks, and patience. Sleep itself didn't even come in one neat package. Before modern lighting twisted our circadian rhythms into spaghetti, people often experienced segmented sleep. They'd drift off shortly after sunset, wake up for an hour or two around midnight, sometimes to pray, sometimes to tend the fire, and sometimes to have a quiet chat, or an even quieter dinner, and then sleep again until dawn. This break in the middle was charmingly known as the first sleep and the second sleep. So really, if you've ever woken up at 2 a.m. and stared at the ceiling, wondering why you're conscious and oddly hungry, don't worry. You're just a few centuries ahead of your time. But truly, the central figure of warmth in these frigid monochrome nights was the hearth. That crackling bundle of firewood, or what was left of it, served as the sun's understudy during its long winter absence. Families would bank the hearth before bed, covering the embers with ash to keep them alive until morning. This was both practical and poetic, a small ghost of daylight preserved beneath layers of soot, and the fire brought everyone close. Perhaps too close. Privacy wasn't exactly a medieval keyword. Most family members, pets, and possibly even the neighbor, who just needed a place to stay for a few nights, slept together in the same room, maybe even the same bed. It was warm. It was cozy. It was fragrant. Layers of humanity stacked like lasagna, radiating shared body heat, and stories whispered quietly in the dark. And if you're wondering about socks, yes, people had them sometimes. Made of wool or, for the affluent, woven silk. But for many, keeping your feet warm involved clutching a hot brick wrapped in cloth, heating a pot of embers and sliding it under the bed. Or, in particularly desperate regions, sharing toe space with a sleepy goat named Wiggles. Now let us drift again, this time farther east, where ancient Romans faced winter with a shrug, a bath, and underfloor heating. Yes, the Romans invented the hypocaust, a system of channels that ran beneath their villas, circulating warm air to heat rooms from below. It was the original radiant heating, minus the user manual and annual maintenance subscription. Most Romans, however, didn't live in opulent villas. The average tenement dweller did what he could. They wrapped themselves in tunics and cloaks, drank hot wine spiced with herbs and optimism, and occasionally visited the public baths, not just for hygiene, but for central heating. Some lingered there all day, walking a slippery tightrope between comfort and being lightly boiled. Even in colder spots like Gaul or the High Alps, people figured out warmth by necessity and local know-how. Walls were built thicker, ceilings lower. Doors were more like complicated blankets, and if you were lucky, a large animal or two would share your home, adding both insulation and the gentle soundtrack of snoring bovines. And so, across continents and centuries, the same truth quietly glowed. Warmth was not just luxury, it was life. Fire crackled, wool wrapped, breath curled in air, and families huddled together like human embers, banking their energy for the survival of night. Speaking of warmth, what did these ancient souls eat to fuel their inner fires during such freezing nights? We'll approach the coals of cuisine next, and find perhaps more gruel than gourmet. As the northern winds began to worm their way through wooden shutters and poorly sealed roofs, our ancient ancestors did what any reasonable person would do when faced with sub-zero temperatures and no central heating. They got weirdly creative. Let's take a chill, stiffened stroll into an Iron Age roundhouse. The first thing you might notice, it's surprisingly smoky. That's not just someone over-enthusiastically tending the fire, it's on purpose. Instead of chimneys, they let smoke from the central hearth slowly ooze up into the thatched ceiling, which, yes, sounds like an asphyxiation hazard, but was actually part of their top-tier insulation strategy. All that smoke not only made airborne pests reconsider their life choices, it also helped keep the thatch pest-free and slightly more fire retardant. A smoky roof, it turns out, was the Iron Age version of eco-friendly spray foam. Down at floor level, things were snug in a more familiar way. People huddled close together, and not just for gossip. Bodies were the preferred central heating units, with entire families, and sometimes livestock, tucked in near the fire under furs and blankets of undetermined cleanliness. Yes, that slightly aromatic man in the corner was probably your uncle. And yes, you'd be spooning the goat tonight. The goat was warm and non-judgmental, two qualities highly prized in a bedfellow during ancient winters. But cozying up inside only worked if you were, well, inside. For those stuck out wandering the frostbitten trails, shepherds, traders, or the unlucky soul designated thatched roof fixer during a snowstorm, life got icier. The solution? Layers. So many layers. Wool was the ancient MVP, and not the nice, synthetic kind that wicks sweat. We're talking itchy, unprocessed wool that made your skin feel like it was in a minor dispute with itself all day. People would wrap themselves in thick tunics, woolen leggings, cloaks pinned with bronze brooches, and sometimes even felted hats that resembled slightly misshapen muffins. But hey, a warm muffin is better than a cold scalp. Of course, food played its part too. A well-fed body is a warmer body, so winters were prime time for stews, and we use the word stew generously. A bubbling cauldron over the hearth was the ancient equivalent of a slow cooker, filled with whatever was available: root vegetables dug from cold soil, bits of dried meat, foraged herbs, and the ever-reliable onions, whose flavor carried the dish when everything else fell short. These stews would stay on the fire for days, with new ingredients added as needed. You didn't so much serve the stew as participate in an ongoing culinary conversation. And speaking of culinary endurance, let's not forget the ancient flatbreads. They were the perfect winter companion, quick to cook on a hot stone by the fire and requiring little more than grain, water, and mild existential resolve. People dunked them into their everlasting stews or used them as primitive spoons. Some toasted them to near rock-like crispiness and used them to break winter ice off the water buckets. Functional and fortifying. Then there was the drink. In place of modern mugs of hot cocoa or overpriced seasonal lattes, imagine warm ale, lightly spiced with herbs. Not always delicious, not always safe. Fermentation was more folk art than science, but often just boozy enough to make you forget your toes were numb. In more refined circles, like those of the Romans or later medieval nobility, mulled wine stepped in with flair, heavy with cinnamon, honey, and whatever fruit hadn't yet rotted. It was less a drink and more a warm cloak in goblet form. But back in our roundhouse, with smoke curling lazily toward the rafters and embers crackling with a sleepy sort of rhythm, the ancient family begins to doze. Their well-fed bellies hum quietly, echoing a day lived well, bundled, fed, and accompanied by various warm things that bleated or barked. In this slow, smoky haven, time winds down, and just as the fire seems ready to sigh its last glowing breath, another pile of peat gets tossed on. The room brightens slightly. Someone burps. The goat murmurs approvingly. But outside, beyond the glowing circle of heat and humanity, winter still waits, as do the silent rituals of preparing for sleep itself. Let's tiptoe closer. Nobody ever talks about the socks. When we imagine the ancient world surviving winter, especially in the ice-laced drafts of early huts or stone dwellings, we're quick to picture grand hearths roaring with firewood, fur-lined cloaks, and maybe a medieval fellow muttering curses at the frost while misplacing his sixth mitten of the day. But the humble sock rarely gets the applause it deserves. Back in ancient Egypt, where winters were only mildly cranky by modern standards, archaeologists uncovered hand-knitted wool socks dating to around the 4th century AD. What's surprising isn't just their age, it's their design, split-toed, like they were meant for flip-flops. Imagine tiptoeing through chilly mornings in your ancient sandals, with your big toe feeling fashionably separated. Somehow, it seems both genius and slightly cursed. But head north, far north, and you'll discover that foot fashion became a survival necessity rather than avant-garde curiosity. In Iron Age Europe, before Nike and UGG strode into history, people relied on felted wool, soft leather, and layers upon layers. Some even stuffed shoes with straw or dried grass for insulation, which sounds suspiciously like the prehistoric predecessor to a memory foam sole. Except less memory, more hay fever. Now, while feet were one thing, entire bodies needed to survive long, bitter winters without the luxury of thermostats or heated seats in sedans. The Norse, masters of scowling into snowy horizons, had a cozy trick. They relied on the varme hus, a small, fire-heated hut usually shared with livestock. Yes, cows, possibly a goat, and a chicken or three if they weren't too rowdy. The animals generated body heat, and the people grew remarkably tolerant of barnyard smells in exchange for not freezing into Viking popsicles. These longhouses weren't just warm, they were social saunas. Families shared benches, skins, and stories, not to mention occasional sneezes. Imagine curling up beside your sibling, a goat, your Uncle Gunner, and someone's wool-covered feet, all beneath a roof of thatch, while wind screamed like a banshee outside. It wasn't just surviving the cold, it was surviving the symphony of nighttime snoring from pigs and relatives alike. And for those without goats, there was always the fire. Open hearths were the beating heart of the winter household. But, funnily enough, they weren't terribly efficient. Most of the heat went straight up through the chimney or, in earlier dwellings, escaped right through a hole in the ceiling. So people got creative. Enter bed curtains. Canopy beds weren't just aesthetic, they were functional bedrooms within rooms. Draw the curtains, trap your own breath and body warmth, and voila, primitive central heating, and blissfully less smoke inhalation. In Japan, long before electric blankets arrived, families huddled around the kotatsu, a low wooden table with a heat source underneath and a thick quilt draped all around it. People would stretch their legs under the futon, like toes dipping into a warm pond of carbon embers. Many refused to leave it for much of winter. Some even slept there, heads resting on the tabletop like sleepy cats, warmed not just by the warmth itself, but the shared coziness of closeness. Of course, closeness has its complications. In many parts of the world, beds were shared, not just with spouses, but with extended family, friends, and possibly delivery men who arrived after dark. In medieval inns, strangers renting space by the night often found themselves bundled beside total unknowns. Personal space, a modern myth. Cold was the great equalizer. It made spoons out of strangers. And still, in the deepest nights of winter, people found small joys. They told stories, often the same ones every year, passed down like a warm scarf. They brewed warm drinks, simple things like hot beer or spiced milk. They sang. There were nights when the frost etched silver patterns on windows, and the only defense was laughter under blankets and toes chasing patches of residual warmth in the bed. Comfort, in those long-gone winters, wasn't just fire or fur or hay-stuffed boots. It was togetherness, the kind that made you forget the draft stealing in through the door or the snow sneaking under the thatch. And if someone happened to gift you a pair of wool socks for the solstice, you didn't roll your eyes. You grinned, because honestly, your toes hadn't felt anything since November. But winter didn't just shape how people slept or huddled. It also transformed how they ate, heartier, fattier, and always, if they were lucky, warm. Just wait until you hear what passed for stew. of all the things winter demanded throughout history, thicker furs, fuller soups, and a general increase in the number of small animals sacrificed for mittens, perhaps none was as universally revered as the sacred, crackling ritual of the fire. Fire spoke its own language in ancient winters, one composed entirely of warmth, light, and the occasional pop of a damp log protesting its fate. Now, before you picture mammoth hunters gathered around a bonfire like a caveman. Barbecue. Let's ease our sleepy minds into something a bit more subtle. Because the art of staying warm in the ancient world wasn't just brute force. It was ingenuity cloaked in wool. Humans were very clever, especially when mildly terrified of freezing to death. Motivated innovation, one might say. Let's start in ancient Rome, where the wealthy elite discovered an ingenious solution known as the hypocaust. The word hypocaust is Latin and translates roughly to, "Please heat my blessed marble floors before my toes mutiny again." This system channeled hot air beneath floors and through hollow walls, functioning not unlike a very early central heating system, though with far more slaves and fewer thermostats. But the hypocaust had its requirements: money, labor, and an architect who wouldn't accidentally direct searing heat into a wine cellar or a marble bath. So for those less rich in coin and more rich in cold, Roman winter warmth relied on the classics: braziers, wool cloaks, and layered tunics that, if unwound carelessly, could double as escape ropes from high windows. Meanwhile, in the frost-kissed landscapes of northern Europe, things got a bit smokier. Viking longhouses weren't warded by delicate plumbing and underfloor toasting panels. No, these were sturdy timber halls, with open fires burning in the center and smoke drifting lazily up through a smoke hole in the roof. The entire chimney design was essentially, some of the smoke goes up, the rest builds character. People and livestock often shared living quarters, not out of an abundance of affection for goats, but because the combined body heat of 10 humans, 3 oxen, and a particularly warm dog could make a longhouse feel like a sauna with hay. Bedrooms, if one had the luxury of segmenting space in a building primarily designed to not collapse, were often curtained recesses, thick with woolen blankets and animal skins. Beds themselves might feature bed straw, which was precisely what it sounds like, straw in your bed, possibly mingled with a little bit of whoever slept there last. It was organic, biodegradable, and as we now know, quite friendly to fleas. And yet, even in chillier climes, human creativity persisted. In Japan, the kotatsu was born, a low wooden table covered by a heavy blanket with a hot coal brazier tucked beneath. Families would slide under, feet first, warmed by the heat and lulled into docile drowsiness by the telling of quiet stories and occasional illegal foot tickles. The kotatsu was a hearth without a fire, an embrace of furniture, thermal philosophy, and the universally recognized desire to never ever get up again. Let's not forget the humble warm stone, a surprisingly popular heating device across many cultures. Long before the hot water bottle slithered into Victorian bedrooms, ancient folks would heat stones in their fires, wrap them in cloth, and slip them into beds. Like prehistoric, microwavable teddy bears, they offered radiant consolation to frostbitten toes. Portable, reusable, and only semi-lethal if dropped from a shelf, these stones carried the comforting memory of fire. In colder monasteries scattered across medieval Europe, monks developed a habit of sleeping fully clothed, mostly because it saved time, and honestly, because it was marginally less suicidal. Wooden sandals and linen undertunics might not have screamed sleepwear, But when wind howled through stone corridors and frost formed on candle stubs, fashion yielded to survival. And finally, of course, there was the blanket fort of the past, the family bed. Households, especially in frigid northern villages, often slept together under a single, massive blanket. Children, grandparents, spouses, the occasional bewildered cat. It was a community solution to a climatological crisis wrapped up neatly in wool and collective body heat. There was warmth in proximity, conversation, breathing, and a noted, if unspoken, etiquette about who had wizard-level control over the blanket corners. So, as the ancient world curled up through the longest nights, huddled around fires, heated stones, low tables, and each other, it did what it always does best: adapt, survive, and subtly perfect the art of staying slightly less miserable than the season wanted them to be. Let's drift now, calmly and cozily, toward another curiosity of wintry life. What did ancient people actually eat when the snow fell and gardens said no? Now we drift gently to the highlands of medieval Scotland, a land where the wind had absolutely no plans to whisper politely. It howled like a bagpipe on a personal rampage, right through the cracks in stone walls, under your woolen kilt, and straight into your soul. Winters here were less a season and more of an annual endurance contest between humans and the sheer stubbornness of cold. Yet somehow they managed, not just to survive, but to sleep, sup, and even stay warm in ways that now seem both ingenious and slightly questionable. Let's begin with the bed. Now, imagine a wooden box with high sides, a box bed tucked directly against the wall. Not for decoration, mind you, but as a blunt force defense against drafts so aggressive they could curdle your milk from across the room. One would climb into these box beds as though entering a modest wooden closet, close the tiny wee doors behind them, and vanish into the darkness with only a sheepskin blanket, one's own body heat, and perhaps the faint hope of surviving January. If this sounds claustrophobic, remember, they weren't worried about space. They were worried about freezing into a decorative popsicle next to the fireplace, and the box bed was victory by insulation. Of course, humans are social creatures, especially when cold. In many Highland households, entire families, and I do mean entire families, sheep sometimes included, would sleep in the same room and occasionally the same bed. Nothing like tripping over a cousin and two chickens en route to the chamber pot to remind you of your humble, shared humanity. Ah yes, heating. In a time before central heating or even consistent floors, the hearth was queen. Stone cottages often had a fire burning at the centre, where peat, the most agreeable flavour of ancient swamp, was burned all day long. When the fire got low, people would rake the embers into a pile and cover it with ash to keep it smouldering overnight. This wasn't done out of romantic longing for the orange glow of coals beneath the bedpost. It was survival wrapped in soot and the scent of damp earth. But peat fires weren't just about warmth. Oh no, they were multi-purpose marvels. You could cook on them, dry your socks over them, and even claim to have a conversation with a ghost if you stared at the smoke long enough. Just don't ask the ghost to do the dishes. Meals, as one might suspect, were designed less for delight and more for durability. Stews were the favoured weapon against the chill, and mercifully so. One cauldron could simmer for days, with ingredients fluctuating dramatically based on availability, wealth, and how brave one was feeling about pond fowl. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, and the mighty neeps joined salted meats and barley in the bubbling mix. Sometimes the stew was half food, half family legend. And while table manners may have existed in the grand halls of the nobility, most Highland folk ate from shared bowls, sometimes using spoons carved from horn, or a sturdy loaf of bread, used as a combination plate and edible sponge. It was warm, filling, and more than sufficient fuel for surviving another night in a house where the wind was your most persistent companion. Clothing indoors, yes please, and lots of it. Wool was lifeblood here, never mind whether it itched. Wool kept you warm, wet or dry, and was often layered in such quantity that children routinely disappeared into their own sweaters. Great cloaks were standard fare, serving as both overcoat and blanket, and, in emergencies, rudimentary tent. Oh, and let us not forget the humble foot warmer. A small wooden box filled with glowing embers and tucked under cloaks or chairs during particularly bitter evenings. These were less cozy trinkets and more like primitive electric blankets without the electricity and with a mild fire hazard. But hey, warm feet. As night deepened and the fire settled into a dull red glow, people might mumble stories steeped in ancient folklore. Tales of selkies and kelpies, whispered with the calm gravity of those who knew better than to laugh at river spirits. And then, wrapped in wool, closeness, and the sour sweet scent of peat smoke, the Highlander would drift off, to the sound of the wind at the walls, and the faint bleat of a sheep who had once again claimed the warmest spot. Now, if you'll just tuck your blanket a little closer, we'll tiptoe next into another curious hearth, where Roman engineering meets cold feet, and sleeping warm becomes a mathematical affair. In the flickering hush of a long-forgotten winter, somewhere between the mountains of Macedonia and the marshlands of Mesopotamia, people turned to one powerful force for survival: soup. Not sleek, modern soup with fancy branding and a rustic font on the can, but the slow, simmering kind. Broth born of desperation and invention, swirling with roots, bones, hope, and possibly that one carrot someone forgot they were saving for spring. Women and men of the ancient world were remarkably skilled at turning a meager assortment of ingredients into something heated, hearty, and life-affirming. Not because they were passionate chefs, mind you, though we're sure there were culinary divas in every Iron Age village, but because in the thick of midwinter, when the winds clawed through wooden huts and frost painted your eyelashes shut, warm food wasn't a luxury. It was all that stood between you and turning into an unsuccessful ice sculpture. In Roman Britain, for example, folks huddled around stone hearths, ladling out bowls of pottage. Think stew, but more vague. It was a sort of ongoing soup kept warm in earthen pots, and into it went whatever could be foraged, found, or begged off a neighbour. A few turnips, maybe a lentil if you were feeling extravagant. Some communities added a bit of stale bread to thicken it, creating a pleasing sort of medieval concrete that, when cooled, could also be used to patch wall cracks or discipline unruly sons. But let us not forget the true backbone of ancient winter cuisine: bone broth. Yes, long before modern influencers began sipping collagen through glass straws while explaining the benefits of intermittent sadness, ancient folks were doing it for far more basic reasons, like not dying. A pot was set to boil, bones were dropped in. Any bits of goat, pig, ox, maybe something unidentifiable, and it was left to stew for hours, imparting flavor and, crucially, warmth. In snowy regions of China during the Han Dynasty, families stationed near the frontiers developed complex broths rich with medicinal herbs and fragrant roots like ginger and scallion. These winter hot pots weren't just food, they were communal, bubbling rituals. Everyone dipped, everyone shared. Everyone politely ignored the fact that Uncle Lao just dropped his entire hand in while fishing out a mushroom. Food in winter was not just substance, it was social glue. Eating together by firelight helped keep spirits high and blood sugar stable. In Germanic tribal villages, roast meats were often prepared for midwinter feasts, hung over roaring fires, dripping sizzling fat into iron pans. And though these feasts were partly religious in purpose, it's safe to say that after days of icy breath and frozen bed straw, nobody really needed an excuse to come indoors and enjoy a hot leg of venison and a strong spiced ale. Speaking of ale, fermentation didn't stop just because the rivers turned to ice. In fact, there's something quite poetic about ancient people cracking open a roughly sealed jug of something remarkably alcoholic and saying, "Ah yes, I shall risk both blindness and joy tonight." Mead, made from fermented honey, was the winter beverage of choice across Celtic lands. It was sweet, warming, and possibly invented after someone forgot a honey jar in the rain. And yes, there were delicacies reserved for the bold. In Norse villages, they had a dish called sursadir hrutspunga. Yes, fermented ram's testicles. A moonlit delight, if you will. It was a symbol of strength, bravery, and a digestive system that didn't flinch under pressure. Throughout these frosty centuries, across countless cultures, eating in the winter became more than survival. It was ceremonial, sacred even. The preparation of seasonal foods brought families huddling closer around the hearth, passing down knowledge with a ladle in hand. It was an art form, a coping mechanism, and the original excuse not to go outside. And when the bowls were empty and the fire low, bellies full and limbs growing slack with warmth, people retreated to their beds, be they piled with furs or just straw, and a quiet prayer for fewer fleas. Sleep came easier with hot food in the gut and a story shared over the firepost. And now, under your own blankets, perhaps without pottage, but with electric radiators and climate-controlled pillows, let your thoughts wander just a little further back in time, as we slip next into the nighttime blankets of the ancient world. If you were a Roman soldier posted to the northern fringes of Britannia in the 2nd century CE, well, I hope you like damp socks and questionable soup. Back then, staying warm during ancient winters wasn't a matter of cranking up the thermostat. It was more about strategic layering, clever engineering, and a striking tolerance for discomfort. Let's cozy up and peer into the stone-framed life of a Roman frontier outpost. You're stationed at Hadrian's Wall. It's December, maybe January, maybe just a really rude March. The wind howls like a cursed pan flute, and sleet crashes sideways against your helmet. You trudge into the barracks wrapped in a woolen cloak, most likely dyed army-issue drab. Underneath it, layered tunics. Your foot wrappings, a sort of ancient sock-scarf hybrid called udons, were not so much warm as a hopeful gesture. Now, here's the thing. Romans didn't typically believe in central heating, unless, of course, you were lucky enough to be stationed somewhere posh with a hypercourse waseichi system. This was their version of radiant floor heating, only Roman style. They lit a fire under the floor and let the heat rise through empty spaces built beneath. Ingenious, yes. Cozy, occasionally. Safe, debatable. Carbon monoxide and accidental toasting of the family goat were not uncommon. But unless your commanding officer had a vision of architectural magnificence or very cold toes, your accommodations probably involved a stone floor colder than the stare of a stern centurion and a brazier that coughed smoke like a tired dragon. The ancient brazier, fueled by charcoal, was portable and handy, though it had a dramatic tendency to consume both oxygen and eyebrows. Meanwhile, in the surrounding villages, the native Britons had their own way of handling the chill. Roundhouses, circular dwellings with thick wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs, were the ancient British cousin of the modern yurt. In the centre, a fire pit smoked merrily, or not so merrily, under a vent hole in the roof, and families would gather around it, wrapped in rough-spun cloaks and questionable optimism. Important side note for bedtimes and babies: swaddling was not just for adorableness. Infants were wrapped like tiny burritos, not just for comfort, but also to preserve precious warmth. And the placement of beds, or sleeping pelts really, was strategic. Right near the fire, but not in it. The line between warmed and flambéed was very fine in ancient domestic design. In colder parts of the ancient world, like Scandinavia or Siberia, hibernation was, if not literal, certainly spiritually embraced. Winter was a time of slowing down, conserving heat and calories, and sleeping long hours bundled under furs. Darkness arrived early, left late, and the world seemed to whisper, "You really don't have to go outside unless you absolutely must." Speaking of calories, the human body's best natural heating source, besides, fire and judgmental looks, is good, solid food. In the deep midwinter, our ancestors would pile on the stews, root vegetables, preserved meats, the occasional dried fish that somehow still smelled like last Tuesday's thunderstorm. Hearty grains like barley or spelt would simmer in pots, bubbling sleepily over the fire, feeding both the belly and the soul. And when it came time to sleep, people got inventive. Families often slept in the same room or even the same bed, not out of necessity only, but efficiency. Why heat the whole house when you can heat one room with body heat and silent judgment? They used woolen blankets, animal pelts, dried straw mattresses, and in some luxurious corners of the Roman Empire, feather-stuffed mattresses. Yes, really. Though if you've ever tried to pluck a goose in winter, you'll understand why such bedding remained, how shall we say, aspirational for most. And let us not forget the ancient hot water bottle, warmed stones wrapped in cloth and tucked under blankets. Practical and possibly double duty as foot warmers and mild ankle deterrents. Ever kicked a granite pebble at 2 a.m? As the wind keened against the wooden shutters and flames danced shadows across stone walls and ceiling beams, our ancient ancestors would curl up, sigh, and drift into the kind of sleep that only comes when warmth has been hard won. And just like that, across centuries and fire pits, we're not so different. Now then, just imagine what they might have eaten to prepare for nights like these. Something warm, something heavy, something cooked slowly. Let's wander into their kitchens next. Let's wander now to a part of the winter experience that often gets romanticized in paintings. Flickering fires, fur-wrapped nobles, the occasional lute in the background. But brace your sleepy curiosity. The reality of staying warm in ancient winters was far less poetic and far more odorous. Long before central heating and smart thermostats became winter's most cherished sidekicks, our ancestors relied on inventive, sometimes questionable, methods to stay warm. These methods range from clever engineering to elaborate clothing, and a few ideas that probably sounded better in theory than they felt at 2 a.m. in a drafty stone house. Let's start with fire. Everyone loves a good hearth, right? That charming crackling, the warm glow. Ah yes, but in ancient times, maintaining that glow required a considerable amount of effort, and often an entire family's commitment to the sacred art of not freezing to death. The ancient Romans, never ones to settle for discomfort, developed a clever system known as the hypocaust. Essentially, it was underfloor heating powered by fires in furnaces that sent warm air flowing beneath raised floors and through hollow walls. Very posh for those who could actually afford it. If you weren't fabulously wealthy and living in a Roman villa, your winter might be more shortbread crumbs inside a wool sock than lavish subterranean sauna. In colder climes like ancient Scandinavia, warmth was a matter of layering and proximity, with Vikings huddling together in longhouses designed to conserve body heat and trap smoke, not because they loved the smell of burnt cabbage, mind you, but because every bit of warmth counted. These longhouses often doubled as stables, so yes, that meant cows and humans shared living quarters. You haven't quite known cozy until you've dozed off beside a slightly damp goat named Ingrid. Clothing was another armor against the frost, and ancient people took it very, very seriously. In medieval Europe, folks bundled up in layers of linen, wool, and, if you were the McMoneybags of your village, fur. Wool was a superstar fabric, moisture-wicking, incredibly warm, and politely itch-inducing. Now, to sleep warm, that was a whole other art form. You might think the height of winter luxury would involve big, feathery duvets, but no. Many sleepers relied not on blankets, but on bedfellows. Entire families slept squeezed together on the same narrow pallet or straw mattress, turning human warmth into a kind of nocturnal central heating. The privacy issues were monumental, and snoring disputes were inevitable, but compared to frostbite, worth it. And then there were warm bricks. Yes, actual bricks. Homes without fireplaces in every room, a lot of them, often relied on heated stones or bricks wrapped in cloth. You'd warm them by the fire, trot them to bed, and tuck them under your covers like primitive hot water bottles. Naturally, this sometimes meant waking up next to a lukewarm rock. Romantic? Perhaps not. Practical? Incredibly. Let's not forget the wonders of nightcaps. No, not the bourbon by the fire variety, though that's certainly noble in its own way, but the literal hats worn to bed. Even inside, drafty conditions made sleep chic hats a must. Men, women, children, all went to bed looking like sleepy garden gnomes. Historians aren't entirely sure when they fell out of fashion, but we lost something wonderful and very flammable when we drifted away from slumberwear millinery. And if you ever worried you were too cozy under your modern duvet, let me reassure you, in some ancient houses, especially in the British Isles, upper floor bedrooms had no ceiling insulation and large gaps in the walls. Snow could drift in, actual snow, landing politely on the blanket like a frosty little house guest. Still, as cold as nights could be, people adjusted. They learned to relish warm porridge in the mornings, to keep their outerwear at the foot of the bed for a quick redonning, and to view shared warmth not as a burden, but a bond. You weren't just surviving winter. You were doing it with your goose, your cousin Olaf, and a brick named Gerald. And tonight, as we leave the fire gently crackling and step softly into the next room of history, we'll find that warmth wasn't just about fire. It was about finding comfort in unlikely places, including the kitchen. For ancient winter kitchens were so much more than spaces for stews. They were the heart of survival. Snowflakes drifted over the vast steppes of Central Asia like tiny dancers too shy for applause. It was winter in the Mongol Empire, a season not feared by the people of the yurts, but regarded with the kind of wary respect one gives to a bear who might be hibernating, or might just be pretending. The Mongols, those famous horseback conquerors who once painted most of the Eurasian map with a single colour, let's call it expansionist beige, were also masters of the cold. Not because they welcomed it, but because they endured it cleverly, stubbornly, and often on horseback. Unlike the settled folk of medieval cities, Mongols lived in portable homes known as gyrs or yurts. Picture a large, cosy cupcake tent made of felt and purpose. The walls were layers of sheep's wool compressed into thick felt, seasoned with smoke, sweat, and centuries of stubborn innovation. These mobile retreats were surprisingly warm inside, warmed by fires stoked at the center and insulated by the body heat of 5 generations and possibly a horse or two who snuck in uninvited. Now, sleep was an athletic event in a Mongol winter. Families would pile inside their gyr like spoons in a communal drawer, the parents on the outer edges, shielding the children curled in the middle like a warm dumpling filling. They didn't have beds, not really, just thick mats and perhaps layers of fox fur that looked suspiciously like last week's pest problem turned into this week's blanket. They'd sleep in their clothes naturally, layers upon layers. Woolen trousers, felt boots, known as gutuls, and tunics fastened tightly at the waist. If you removed your clothes in a Mongol winter, you weren't brave. You were immediately and fatally foolish. The cold, after all, didn't take prisoners. But sleep wasn't merely about warmth. It was also about placement. You slept with your head facing east, toward the rising sun. It was respectable, auspicious, and helpful, given that if you accidentally slept westward, you might end up snuggled next to the family goat, who didn't believe in personal space or basic manners. The Mongolian night was alive with sound. Horses whickering in the distance, the flap of felt in a biting wind, and the whispered lull of old tales. Tales of Genghis Khan, born clutching a blood clot in his hand, which was either alarming or impressive, depending on one's opinion of birth accessories. These tales were not just entertainment. They were oral maps of identity, helping people find comfort in epic lineage as the snow stacked itself politely on the gyr's domed roof. So how did they stay warm all day? Not just at night. The diet, of course. Mongols had the kind of winter menu that would terrify a vegan and impress a nutritionist. It was protein-heavy, fat-laden, and designed to make you feel like you could ride through a snowstorm and still have energy to invade something by noon. Horse milk, fermented into a mild fizzy beverage called kumis, was both a drink and a dare. Rich in calories, slightly alcoholic, and known to cause polite facial spasms in the uninitiated, kumis was standard fare. There were also thick mutton stews, boiled organ meats, and a dairy product delightfully known as arul, dried curds the texture of sun-dried rocks, but strangely comforting when your teeth weren't needed for anything else. Staying warm then was a full-body philosophy. You wrapped it around yourself in felt, swallowed it in hot broth, and tucked yourself into it beside your family. You slept close, you spoke softly, and you kept moving through the day because the moment you stood still too long, the cold crept in with ideas. And as the night deepened across the steppe, the stars sweeping overhead like arrows frozen mid-flight, one could almost believe that even the wolves paused to listen to the lullabies of 1,000 crackling fire pits scattered across the endless frost. Let's drift now, gently, carried in a felt yurt through time, as we float toward the flickering hearths of another ancient world, where firelight flickered across sandstone and prayers drifted through chill desert air. The Norse had a word for winter that was practically a flex, fimbulvetter. Not just your average flurry. Oh no, this was the great winter, a mythical cold snap so intense that it made your longboat creak in sympathy and your beard freeze to your tankard. And while we don't know how much of Fimbulveten was poetic license and how much was just some unusually brisk Januaries, we do know that ancient winters across Europe and beyond rarely gave anyone the luxury of feeling warm, unless they got creative. Now picture a longhouse, lit faintly by the flicker of a tallow candle. These were communal dwellings common in Iron Age Northern Europe, where families, and sometimes their livestock, stayed bundled together under a single, drafty, but structurally enthusiastic roof. Privacy was a myth. So was central heating. But body heat? Oh, that was the original crowdsourced thermostat. Blankets in these chill cocoons weren't the plush throws of today, hand-knit by aesthetic cottagecore influencers. They were more likely layers of animal hide stitched with sinew and good intentions, sometimes layered onto woolen wraps thick as a winter stew. If you were lucky, your bedding was permeated with the warm perfume of lanolin, natural sheep oil, and just a hint of wet dog. Don't let that image fool you into imagining gloom, though. These houses were not silent ice caves. In fact, they buzzed with nightly rituals designed to forget that one's toes had become little ice marbles. Storytelling, shadow games, whispered gossip. It was a Netflix queue of oral tradition. Elders recounted tales of frost giants, trickster gods, and suspiciously misbehaving weather patterns. Stories brewed strong for both entertainment and survival. And while you drift through this wintry dream, spare a thought for warm food, the essential partner to battling cold. A hearty stew left to simmer for hours in a clay pot, balancing on hot stones, could feed many and warm even more. Root vegetables, dried legumes, and salted meat played supporting roles, while humble onions and garlic gave Oscar-worthy performances in flavor. A shared pot, sometimes thick enough to stand a spoon like a ship's mast, acted like soup and central heating, all in one. In mountainous regions like the Alps, where the snow came not in flakes but in dominant avalanche personalities, people turned to cheese, not just as food, but as winter's edible time capsule. Milk collected in summer became hard wheels of preservation. You could store them for months. Or, as some cheesemongers presumably concluded after attempting to gnaw on a 2-year-old wheel, simply arm yourself with a sharp knife, a sturdy table, and patience. Meanwhile, over in ancient China, homes used something particularly clever: the kang bed. Imagine an elevated brick platform that could be heated with fire underneath, turning your mattress into an actual warm hug. A literal heated bed. Napping technology at its absolute apex. Don't let Silicon Valley convince you they invented sleep tech. The ancient Chinese were already snoozing on thermostatically engineered surfaces, eating hot noodles beside them, no less, while your modern mattress was still a twinkle in a post-industrial eye. In colder corners of Japan, the kotatsu came to power. Not so much a glorious throne as a low table draped in a thick blanket with a hibachi or heater underneath. Family members huddled beneath, sometimes remaining there for hours, or let's be honest, forever. If your legs were warm and you had rice cakes within reach, why would you ever move? All this may sound rather snug now, but remember, none of this warmth came passively. It came from effort, felling trees, stoking stoves, mending fur, stirring pots, boiling water, hauling peat, pickling with desperation and vinegar. Winter was a full-time job, but there was a rare poetry in these labors. Each gust of wind against the eaves was answered by laughter near the hearth. every frostbitten morning was greeted with breath rising like ghostly stories from warm mugs. And as flurries thickened outside, it was as if the cold wrote a soft silence into every night, making stillness feel like a luxury. Sleep, in these ancient winters, wasn't just a bodily need, it was an earned reward. A slow descent into comfort carved out bit by bit from the wilderness of ice. Now, wrap yourself in imagined fur, feel the glow of a distant hearth, and follow the steam trails of stew into the heart of a winter's memory. For as the fire dims in the longhouse, a certain medieval bathhouse beckons, heated not by myth, but by the earliest form of radiant floor magic. There is something utterly charming and slightly absurd about the medieval concept of a warming pan. Imagine lying in a poorly insulated castle, its stone walls expertly engineered to retain every molecule of cold and expel any notion of warmth. The fire in the hearth flickers its last embers. Your breath forms misty clouds above your face. You shuffle toward bed, only to find your sheets are approximately the same temperature as betrayal. Enter the warming pan, a shallow metal pan with a lid, stuffed with hot coals from the fire, and slid under the bed covers shortly before someone braved the icy linens. It was a kind of primitive bed microwave minus the power cord, or safety regulations. And yes, sometimes mattresses did catch fire. Not exactly soothing, but decidedly toasty, if temporary. Warming the sleeping quarters required creativity, because not everyone lived in a grand manse with fireplaces the size of oxen. For the everyday medieval villager, heating options were more limited. They didn't have radiators or bathrobes. No, they had proximity to goats. It was not entirely uncommon for families, especially of the lower classes, to bring their livestock indoors during the winter time. This was partially to protect the animals from the cold, but also because an overheated cow is surprisingly efficient at home heating. Your modern space heater hums, theirs mooed. And yet, even the humblest of folk took clever steps to warm themselves in the frostier months. Beds were piled high with straw-stuffed mattresses. Lumpy, yes, but surprisingly insulative. Woolen blankets layered thicker than a knight's gilt lay atop, and always the time-honored solution of snuggling. Families would share beds not just out of affection, but because body heat doesn't charge you rent. Now, if you've ever found yourself numb with cold and thought, what I need is a nice mug of piping hot ale. You may be experiencing something similar to the wintertime logic of the Anglo-Saxons. They believed ale, especially when warmed with spices, helped to heat your insides and fight off the seasonal chill. This folk wisdom doubles as an excuse to drink, something history is excellent at providing. Of course, not everyone succumbed to the lure of liquid warmth. Some cultures developed more sophisticated winter survival strategies, and by sophisticated, we mean they invented the onesie. In the 17th century, wealthy households in England and parts of Northern Europe began commissioning elaborate sleeping garments known as night rails and nightgowns, early forerunners of flannel jammies and onesies. In one particularly inspired fashion detour, some chose to wear bed caps, soft cloth caps meant to insulate the head, the very ridgepole of the body. These were often rendered in fetching paisleys or stripes, as if your brains would catch cold without a sartorial flourish. Even more enterprising were the early Scandinavians, ever masters of cold. They developed saunas not just for bathing and socializing, but as a way to fight harsh winters from the inside out. Families would gather inside these steamy wooden havens to sweat, clean, and commune. Then they would leap into a snowbank, a concept we'd now describe as character building and regrettable. Heating the home itself, if it was feasible, often revolved around fire, which sounds obvious, but ancient people weren't simply throwing logs on with reckless abandon. Firewood was precious. It's why chimneys were designed to funnel heat as smartly as possible. In Japan, homes used a kotatsu, a delightful invention involving a low wooden table with a charcoal brazier underneath, covered with a quilt that trapped your legs in delicious warmth. It was a kind of glowing octopus of heat, tenderly ensnaring cold toes. In contrast, wind-blown Roman villas across northern Europe often used a hypocaust, a system where warm air funneled beneath the floor. Fantastic, but limited to the upper crust, who could afford subterranean central heating and an army of shovel-wielding servants. Wherever you go in history, the cold brought out a unique kind of brilliance and mild desperation. If survival's the mother of invention, then winter was her grumpy, trigger-happy cousin. And so, under quilts, between goat-heated walls, with head caps slipping askew and ale gently steaming by the hearth, our ancestors huddled in and let the freezing winds scratch at the shutters, while sleep crept in like warm fog. Which leads us, with flickering candlelight and cobweb-soft footsteps, to another peculiar corner of ancient sleep, where divided nights ruled the darkness with surprising order. High in the Alps, where the wind learns to howl before it graduates to hurricane, winter was a long and demanding houseguest, one that overstayed its welcome, rearranged the furniture, and made off with the goat cheese. Yet even here, in these frozen cradles of stone and snow, people not only survived the cold, they got pretty creative about it. Let's pause for a moment and wrap ourselves in an imaginary fur cloak, old, musty, and ethically sourced from the dream world. Imagine trudging through crunchy white snow, knee-deep in drift and existential dread, toward a wooden chalet where the roof looks like a slice of burnt toast, and smoke curls rhythmically from the chimney. This is no ski lodge, oh no. This is a 15th century alpine farmhouse, where insulation is measured not in R values, but in how many cows you can fit downstairs. Yes, that's right. In many alpine homes, livestock slept beneath the humans, not because they were the cleanest roommates, but because they came with their own central heating systems. The cows lolled about munching hay and chewing cud, radiating a slow, dreamy body warmth through the wooden floorboards into the sleeping quarters above. It was bovine geothermal heating, modern technology at its rustic peak. Upstairs, the family nestled together in a single room, often sharing beds not just for social cohesion, but for sheer, primal thermodynamics. The phrase "sleep tight" may truly have applied here, because if you didn't press your loved ones like library books on a shelf, you'd wake up as a medieval popsicle. Blankets were heavy, made from wool, layered animal hides, or, in more affluent households, big enough to qualify as personal tents. Linen sheets were prized, but rare, and you did not want to be the person closest to the wall. Stone and frost were intimate friends. Sleep itself followed a curious winter rhythm. With nights stretching longer than a bard's exaggeration, people sank into what we now call segmented sleep. They would fall asleep after sunset, maybe as early as 6 p.m., snooze for a few hours, then wake in the middle of the night for a peaceful interlude. In this quiet time, some would get up to stoke the fire, pray, whisper secrets, or silently panic about livestock taxes. Then, back to bed until dawn politely returned. And food in the winter, was survival cuisine at its finest. Picture dishes slow cooked over embers or hung above the hearth like sacrificial offerings to the god of warmth. Alpine homes often had simmering cauldrons perched on iron tripod stands. Into them went turnips, dried beans, questionable roots, and if fortune shone brightly, a bit of salted pork. The stew would simmer for so long it practically aged into soup wisdom. Salted meats were prized, of course, cured, and hung to dry in pantries so cold they might have accidentally invented the freezer. Smoking was another culinary strategy, and not the tobacco kind. Though rest assured, hundreds of years ago, everyone was vaguely smoking something. Smoked sausages, smoked cheese, smoked fish. If it could lie still long enough, someone smoked it. And what about baking? Well, if you had access to a communal oven, you were in luck. In many mountain villages, once a week, neighbors shared a mighty bread oven, where loaves could feed families and solidify alliances. Bread baked in winter was often dense, sour, and so fibrous it might resent your teeth on principle. But it kept families full, and the digestive tract active. Keeping warm demanded layers, wool on linen, linen on wool, and some occasional moss if you got fancy. These were not fashion statements, but acts of survival. And the accessories: mismatched socks knitted by candlelight, caps for sleeping heads, and mittens so thick you could use them to hush a gossiping neighbor. The fire, of course, was the soul of the household. Birch bark and kindling caught beneath logs split with more hope than precision. Fires weren't just for heat. They were companions, entire characters in the winter drama. Children watched flames dance stories into the rafters as the adults muttered about chimney drafts and the cost of firewood. And despite the hardship, or perhaps because of it, life in these alpine winters carried a certain rhythm. A quiet, smoky resilience. Songs were sung softly. Stories grew richer in the telling. Warmth was not just found in hearths, but in the way people huddled together, sharing body heat and laughter, and occasionally a suspiciously smoky wheel of cheese. The air outside may have sparkled with frost, but inside, within stone walls and beneath the creaky beams, the world grew small, warm, and infinitely human. We'll linger here only a breath longer, before wandering down from the mountains toward villages wrapped in snowdrifts and local superstition, where your nighttime meal might be determined by the winds or the whims of a particularly moody goat. By the time the frost crept down the neck of every chimney and tucked itself into the corners of drafty thatched roofs, our ancient ancestors had already marshaled quite the winter defense, and few things were more essential to outlasting the cold months than hot food, or at least warmish food. Okay, sometimes it was just slightly less cold food. In Northern Europe, particularly among the Norse, winters were harsh enough to make a snowman weep. But the Vikings had a plan. They called it gruel. A name that, admittedly, does not inspire confidence or gastric excitement. Made from whatever grains were on hand, barley, rye, oats, and slow cooked in enormous pots over open hearths, this thick, porridge-like substance doubled as insulation for the stomach and, when left long enough, a building material. Much of ancient northern cuisine was dictated by what wouldn't perish in the long dark. Root vegetables like turnips, onions, and the finally appreciated parsnip were stowed in cold pits and cellars. The hopeful pickled what they could, the resourceful smoked fish and slabs of meat, and the very optimistic buried food in snowbanks with neat little flags to find it again. This was sometimes successful, sometimes not. Foxes have no respect for Viking flags. Meanwhile, in ancient Rome, Winter dining wasn't quite the desperate game of edible hide-and-seek. It was further north. Roman homes, at least those of the wealthy, boasted braziers and hypocaust, those clever underfloor heating systems that mainly reminded everyone how important it was to be on decent terms with your bathhouse engineer. For dining, Romans in chillier parts of the empire turned to boiling stews in clay pots called olla, or wrapping meat in dough and cooking it beside the fire, essentially inventing the humble meat pie long before the English claimed full custody of it. Even their wine was heated during winter. You simply plopped a red-hot poker into a jug of vino and voila. Mulled wine with a hint of regret from all nearby flammable objects. In Japan, after snowfall turned the world into a scroll painting, winter meals took on a poetic warmth. Families gathered around the irori, the sunken hearth, slow-cooking nabe, a communal hot pot of vegetables, tofu, sometimes fish, and dashes of miso or soy sauce. It was eaten piece by piece as the pot simmered through the evening, with everyone gently poaching their food like well-mannered otters. It wasn't just about calories, it was about warmth that buzzed from within. And unlike most Western cold weather meals, these broths were light and clear, designed to warm and hydrate without sending you directly into a post-meal hibernation trance. Still sleepy, yes, but elegant. In the Middle East, winters could be deceptive. Days were still mild in many areas, but nighttime temperatures plummeted. Ancient Persians mastered hearty dishes filled with legumes and lentils, often slow-cooked in clay ovens called tanders, their heat so enduring they could season your dinner, then politely keep you warm through breakfast. They also enjoyed a remarkable winter snack known as kashk, a sort of fermented yogurt product that was surprisingly pleasant once you got past its resemblance to tiny pebbles dipped in footnotes. It was stirred into soups and sprinkled over stews, adding both tang and a boost of winter immunity, confirming the ancient human belief that anything tangy might trick the plague into staying away. Travel across the Silk Road during the colder months, and you'd find traders huddled around smoky fires, eating simmered camel stew and sipping on thick spiced teas out of chipped metal cups. Trade, despite the cold, didn't wait for spring. It just wore more layers. In truth, what kept people warm wasn't just what they ate, it was how they ate it. Most meals in ancient winters were communal affairs. Families and villages gathered around central fires, sharing pots, passing bowls and talking, sometimes murmuring, sometimes singing, and once in a while, just chewing as a team sport. There's a gentle sort of magic in that. The clink of pottery, the hiss of steam against iron, the way laughter fogs in cold air. It didn't matter if the stew was made from lentils or lizards. It was home, and it was warm. And for a little while, the winter stayed outside where it belonged. And somewhere in that steam, just beyond the scent of onions and memories, we'll wander gently into the next quiet question. How did people clean themselves in the freezing months, when water turned to glass and bathing became negotiable? Now, just beyond the crumbling walls of medieval Europe and the frostbitten fingers of feudal farmers, we find ourselves among a peculiar group of winter warriors, monks. Yes, we're slipping inside the stone sanctuaries of medieval monasteries, where silence reigned, prayers echoed, and warmth was mostly hypothetical. Monastic life was a peculiar kind of freezing, the kind where you had both spiritual discipline and no central heating. Monks, those quietly determined men of letters, prayer, and surprisingly robust community structure, spent their winters cloaked in wool robes, cloistering both their souls and their body heat. Their sleeping quarters, known charmingly as dormitories, because nothing says peaceful contemplation like sharing your REM cycle with a dozen other snoring brothers, were often little more than long, unheated halls beneath high-arched ceilings that did a wonderful job of making the cold feel grand and eternal. Blankets were thin, a humble sandwich of linen and maybe sheep's wool if the monastery sheep were feeling generous that year. No pillows either, unless you counted folded habits or fervent hope. Beds, or pallets, were similarly minimal. Wooden planks with straw mattresses so crackly they sounded like they were gossiping every time someone turned over. Now, monks did something rather clever when it came to keeping warm at night. You see, they didn't change into pajamas, a concept not endorsed by any saint, because warmth was paramount and clothing was cumulative. They simply slept in their habits. Layers upon layers of woven wool worn day and night reminded them not only of their vows of simplicity, but also that itching was just another form of spiritual discipline. But before sleep came the most monkish of rituals, the nighttime offices. These were scheduled, prayers held in the still, icy hours between dusk and dawn, prime time for spiritual reflection and chilblains. Around 2 or 3 a.m. they rose, like devout sleepwalkers, to shuffle into the church for matins. Cold enough to see your breath, stone underfoot, the sort of ritual that makes you contemplate both the divine and thermodynamics. Candles flickered dimly in the dark chapels, the only source of light and warmth. More moral than physical, really. And yet, amid chants and incense that clung to frozen air, there was a curious peace, a brotherhood in goosebumps, a harmony between soul and discomfort. Meals during winter were governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, sparse, scheduled, and notably meatless, because why break a vow of abstinence just because your toes are turning blue? One hot meal a day, often lentils, sometimes turnips, always blessed, and perhaps helpfully, served alongside something called a modest amount of wine, which conveniently turns out to be just enough to conjure internal warmth and maybe a smile. The refectory, or dining hall, was usually no warmer than outside, but body heat helped a little. Everyone sat on stone benches in silence, listening as one brother read aloud from scripture or the lives of saints, which, while spiritually nourishing, usually didn't involve tips on surviving frostbite. And as for baths, well, those were rare. Monks considered excessive washing an indulgence of the flesh, and in winter, who could argue? Soaking in cold water was viewed less as a hygienic necessity and more as a poorly advertised martyrdom opportunity. Still, in the middle of all that ascetic chill, there was a certain coziness to monastic life. The rhythm, the predictability, the shared experience of warming yourself by a reading candle or tucking your feet deep into scratchy straw, dreaming of paradise, and perhaps warmer churches. Some monasteries, especially those in colder climes like the Alps or northern Britain, did make modest concessions. The kitchen was sometimes used as a communal warming spot, and infirmaries might have fireplaces for the sick. And even the sternest abbots understood that nobody prays well with frostbitten ears. So the monks endured, not with roaring fires or hot baths, but with habits wrapped tight, souls focused inward, and bellies occasionally lined with lentil stew and spiritual conviction. And as the bells tolled Vespers and then Compline, the brothers would return once again to their long, shared dormitory. Cloaks drawn, feet tucked, whisper prayers murmured into woven wool, until the world went still again. Now, let us quietly tiptoe from the monastery's cold stone halls, making our way to another place where winter night brought both challenge and charm, across the steppe, and into the tents of those who wandered with the wind. If you happen to find yourself trudging through Scandinavia in the dim, slush-laden days of the 9th century, your number one concern would likely not have been, which Netflix show should I binge, but rather, how do I not freeze to death before breakfast? The Norse, champions of snow-splattered persistence, had to get creative in the face of lengthy, brooding winters that seemed to outlast even the most patient goat. While Hollywood likes to dress Vikings in impossibly short tunics and heroic scowls, in reality, warmth, not war, was the true obsession of Nordic life. Let's be honest, it's hard to pillage when your toes have frostbite. Wool was the silent hero of the Nordic saga. Not soft and fluffy wool, mind you, but thick, scratchy stuff that could double as both clothing and exfoliation. The Norse spun it from their hardy local sheep, creatures bred less for cuddliness and more for sheer survival. Every settlement had spinning and weaving stations, churning out layers of warmth faster than you can say fjord. Underlayers were made from linen, a material politely described as crisp, which means slightly more forgiving than bark when freshly harvested. Over that came tunics, trousers, cloaks, and, on especially cold days, an impressive addition, leg wrappings called winningers. These woolen bandages were spiraled up the shins like Viking yoga socks, except there was no yoga, and the exertion was less downward dog and more defend your livestock against wolves. Now, how did they heat their humble halls when the fjord froze and food turned to ice sculptures? That's where the hearth came in. The hearth was the heart, the soul, the literal and emotional glow center of the Viking longhouse. Positioned in the middle of the room, it provided warmth, cooked meals, lit smoky lamps, and occasionally inspired minor philosophical debates such as, should we burn one more log or save it for Ragnar's birthday? Let's paint a cozy picture. A Norse family, bundled in wool, gathers around the smouldering hearth. A pot of fish stew, which is about as thrilling as it sounds, simmers over open flames. A few children sleep near the warm stones, faces soot-smudged, dreams filled with axe battles and honey cakes they'll never actually receive. Outside, the snow howls like a lonely hound, but inside, there's storytelling and carved wooden spoons, and the gentle click of spindle against fibre. But let's not overlook winter's most luxurious indulgence, the fur-lined bed box. Essentially, a wooden coffin of comfort. These boxes were filled with hay or straw, sometimes both, because hay or straw is a false dichotomy in Old Norse bedding philosophy, and covered in furs that were acquired through careful hunting, trading, or, more often, finding a very accidentally expired bear. Crawling into one of these boxes at night was like saying, yes, the world is frozen and grim, but I shall sleep curled next to my goats with elegance. Speaking of livestock, sometimes they slept indoors too, with the wintry elements being the way they were, namely terrifying and relentless. Many families brought smaller animals inside the longhouse, not for warmth in the poetic sense, but in the very practical sense of this chicken puts off heat and eggs. It wasn't unusual to have your sleep occasionally interrupted by a friendly sheep nosing its way into your personal space. The animal's breath made the shared air warmer, and while modern hygiene experts might raise an eyebrow, or three, back then it was just called Tuesday. And how was sleep itself achieved with creaky floorboards and bleating company? The Norse were adaptive nappers. They respected rest, but weren't fussy. Cloaks doubled as blankets, fur hats stayed on heads, and people often slept two to a bed. Not from affection necessarily, but because frostbite is notably less romantic than we think. Winter in the north was not something you conquered. It was something you learned to live with, build around, and sometimes bribe with an extra mug of mead. The Norse learned that slow and steady hibernation could be a kind of strength, and that nothing beats the elemental joy of thawing your boots by the fire while your cousin tells a possibly inaccurate saga about elves. And so, with wool drawn tight and fire dancing low, their winters passed, not quickly, not easily, but with a kind of rugged peace. Let us now drift a little farther south, where icy nights met their own cozy countermeasures, and ancient villagers found peculiar ways to escape the chill. It's a quiet winter's morning in medieval Scandinavia, and the frost sits heavy on the moss-covered roof of a longhouse. The sun, more suggestion than spotlight this time of year, peeks uncertainly over the horizon, casting a pewter light across the snow. And inside this sturdy wooden home, something remarkable is happening. Breakfast. Now, before you imagine a steaming stack of pancakes or eggs sizzling in a copper pan, allow me to gently lower your expectations with love. Breakfast in the early Middle Ages was not so much a meal as a moment, a brief rendezvous between the stomach and whatever could be coaxed from the pantry without waking the chickens. In winter, preserving food wasn't optional. It was survival's favorite hobby. Anything that could be dried, smoked, salted, or buried for safekeeping found a place in the larder. Fish hung like wind chimes over the hearth, strips of lamb jerky curled on crude wooden shelves, and root cellars hummed with the silent charisma of turnips lying in wait. So it was that breakfast might consist of yesterday's barley porridge, now stubborn and solid, lovingly sliced like a loaf and fried in goose fat until it crisped at the edges. The result? Medieval hash browns. Sort of. Chewier, yes. Polish the axe handle with your teeth chewy, but filling. And let's not forget bread, the reliable companion of European tables for centuries. In winter, bread was both nourishment and weapon, coarse, dense, and etched with the personalities of rye, oats, and sometimes ground legumes. A loaf could last longer than a minor royal dynasty. Some families kept a stale wheel of bread hung near the rafters like a pagan ornament, shaving off slices as needed, and sometimes using it in trade. 2 sheared goats and a hunk of 4-week-old rye, all yours. If dairy was available, and that's a big if, when the cows are shivering as hard as the peasants, there might be a knob of sour cheese or a wooden spoonful of curd that had made it through the night. Milk itself was often fermented slightly, because pasteurization had not yet RSVP'd to the party of civilization. This gave rise to drinks with enchanting names like bonnyclabber and soured whey, which sound like something Shakespeare's lesser-known cousin might whisper in a spell. But to the weary winter dweller, they were nourishment incarnate. And then there was beer. Oh yes. A warm mug of mild, grainy ale was often the morning drink of choice. Not to chase away sorrows, though there were plenty of those in February, but because the water quality was, let's say, creatively unreliable. Slightly alcoholic, brewed with herbs like bog myrtle or yarrow, this humble tipple known as small beer was perfect for a frosty sunrise toast to mediocrity. Children drank it, monks brewed it, even grumpy old Olaf, who never smiled and smelled of peat swamp. Yes, even he would pour a mug and grunt in approval. What's noteworthy is not just the meal's contents, but its ritual. Families huddled around the central fire, crouched or seated on low stools. The hearth was the sun of the house, radiating heat, light, and hope. Elders told stories in between bites, legends of wolves with golden eyes, or of trolls who lurked in the snowbanks, waiting for someone too smug to carry a charm of iron filings. Sometimes children were given the task of stirring pots or fetching dried herbs from bundles hung upon the beams. There was pride in usefulness, warmth layered not only in furs and wool, but in belonging. If any meal could be said to fortify not just the body, but the soul, it was this one. The quiet, unfussed gathering of people bound by necessity, modesty, and the smell of yesterday's stew simmered with new conviction. Outside, snowflakes fell slowly, each one minding its own business as it drifted toward the frozen earth. Chickens clucked indignantly at the cold, pressing themselves up against one another in a straw-sprung corner of the barn. And a sleepy sun, like a reluctant candle in the sky, flickered just a little brighter. Somewhere, someone snuck the last slice of porridge loaf and pretended they didn't. An ancient winter truth: if no one saw you, the calories don't count. And so, bellies slightly fuller and cheeks dusky with firelight, our medieval household went on with their day, warmed by crumbs and kinship. But what of those brave souls who didn't dwell in villages or longhouses, those who roamed the wintry wilds by trade or by calling? Their winter mornings were a bit less romantic and rather draftier. Fortunately, we'll be following their frozen footsteps next. As the moon hung low and sullen over frostbitten fields, ancient humans turned to one of civilization's quiet triumphs: soup. Yes, the humble, sloshing cauldron that simmered over smoky hearths across continents was not just a meal. It was a method of winter survival, liquid comfort, and social glue. Forget kings and battles. The real dynasty was brothy. In the bitter heart of winter, when winds howled like unpaid mercenaries and firewood hoarding bordered on competitive sport, people learned quickly that warmth didn't always come from blankets. It often came in bowls. Thick, steaming, questionably identifiable bowls. Let us drift first into medieval Europe, where winters were cold, draughty, and filled with the creeping sensation that one's neighbor was eyeing their cabbage stash a little too possessively. Here, pottage reigned, a kind of eternally bubbling stew. Pottage was the culinary version of a group project. Everything went in. Nobody knew who was responsible for what, and it somehow came out okay. Root vegetables, maybe some salted meat, perhaps the ghost of a turnip that had been near the pot at some point. It all contributed to what we'll generously call flavor. Pottage wasn't just dinner, it was heating. The act of cooking it kept the fire alive, and huddling near the pot offered precious warmth. Families would ladle out helpings with such reverence you'd think they were doling out treasure. And to them, they were, especially when you got a chunk of actual meat, not just broth-borne suggestion. Meanwhile, far to the east, in ancient China, steamy broths took an elevated form in hot pot feasts. Picture it: snow blanketing the courtyard, wind moaning through bamboo lattices, and the family gathered around a bubbling vat of rich soup where thin slices of lamb vanished into steam. This wasn't mere meal. It was ritual, conversation, and central heating. The hot pot was, in essence, early community radiators that just happened to make your lips tingle with Sichuan peppercorns. Even more northward, in Siberian and Scandinavian lands, where the mercury often disappeared entirely from the thermometer out of sheer protest, soup took on survivalist tones. Picture reindeer bone broth, thickened with barley or moss, served in a tent lined with reindeer hides, breath misting the air. Here, broth was medicine, food, and spiritual balm in one wooden bowl. If you were lucky, your tooth didn't crack on a bit of frozen fat. And one mustn't forget the Mesoamerican pozole, Indigenous peoples of what is now Mexico simmered this sacred stew long before Spanish colonizers ever learned to fear the sound of boiling maize. Traditionally made with hominy and ritual pork, or, in earlier and less polite eras, other protein sources best left unspecified as bedtime approaches. Pozole warmed bellies and underlined festivals, ceremonies, and cold nights alike. There's something timeless about soup. It's shape-shifting, resilient, forgiving. It holds history in every ladle. The Jewish chicken soup bubbling in shtetls during Polish winters, the thick, garlic-laced aioli slathered into rustic Provençal fish stews, the andouille-laden gumbos simmering in Creole kitchens during cold southern rains. Soup remembers. Even Roman legions carried dried lentils in their packs to mix with water over a fire, crafting a quick lentil stew hearty enough to fuel an empire. Let that sink in for a moment. Rome, builder of aqueducts and conqueror of shores, moved on lentil stew. History isn't all marble statues and Caesar quotes. Sometimes it's just a weary soldier staring moodily into a bowl of legumes, wondering why all roads led to this. And therein lies the storyteller's secret. The world wasn't warmed by kings or inventions alone. It was warmed by boiling pots of salted, sometimes questionable marvel. In the deep, ungrinning parts of winter, people put whatever they had into a pot, shared it carefully, and gathered together, risking burn blisters for a moment of warmth and a shared joke about how that last potato looked a bit off. So tonight, dear dreamer, if the chill lingers near your feet and your mind drifts toward comfort, imagine yourself centuries ago, hands wrapped around a warm clay bowl, steam curling upward in lazy swirls, the scent of herbs and hope mingling. The fire crackles somewhere near. Someone grumbles fondly about the salt level. Someone else tells a tale of finding a carrot shaped like a nose. And just as the soup simmers into silence, let's wander next into the ancient world's most curious warm-up plan of all. Not food, not fire, but fleece on 4 legs with friendly eyes. In the frosted stillness of the ancient world, where the bite of winter cut through stone walls and woolen cloaks alike, there existed a peculiar invention known as the hand warmer. Now, before you imagine toasty little electric gadgets from a ski resort gift shop, let's step softly back to when staying warm was more art than appliance. In Imperial China, for instance, the elite strolled through palaces with their dainty fingers tucked into polished brass spheres filled with glowing coals. These hand warmers, part portable hearth, part fashion statement, were small, smug braziers with beautiful lattice lids, exhaling just enough warmth to make aristocratic fingertips feel gently toasted rather than entirely frozen. When you're wearing 12 layers of silk and politely trying not to freeze into a Ming Dynasty statue, that sort of targeted warmth is a delicate necessity. Meanwhile, in the frostbitten reaches of feudal Japan, warmth took on more mysterious forms. The kotatsu, which still survives today in various evolutionarily advanced table blanket hybrids, was originally an open hearth structure built into the floor. Families would gather round, their legs snuggled under a heavy quilt that draped over the hearth. You'd eat, chat, and occasionally nod off with your toes dangerously near the embers. Nothing says family bonding like a near fire-induced nap and the smell of mildly singed tabi socks. Over in medieval Europe, nobility had yet another approach entirely, one that involved an odd little object called a bed warmer. This charming contraption looked like a frying pan that took a wrong career turn. It would be filled with hot embers, closed tightly with a lid, hopefully, and then slid between the bed sheets to preheat one's sleeping quarters. The only challenge, not igniting the straw mattress while trying to avoid frostbite. It was all a bit Russian roulette, but with sootier consequences. Now, for the less titled folk, the peasants, serfs, and general population of people sincerely tired of being cold, keeping warm was more of a group effort. Entire families and sometimes even livestock would sleep in a single room, sharing heat with a kind of resigned dignity only shivering together can provide. There is a certain poetry in the phrase bovine-assisted central heating. It's not glamorous, no copper filigree or portable fires, but a soft moo and a shared warmth went a long way on a 12-hour winter night. In Scandinavia, people had fewer options and more snow. Enter the friendliest invention of them all, the fearsome, fur-lined sleeping hood. This delightful garment was not just a hat, it was a helmet of hope, a fortress around your face, armed against the chill winds of Norway's tundras. Some hoods were so large and insulating that one could technically sleep standing up, although that wasn't encouraged after aquavit. And then there were the Vikings, rugged, gloriously bearded, and famously adaptable. They lined their long houses with overlapping planks of timber, sealed the gaps with moss and sheep dung, a cozy combination if you don't think too hard about it, and built central hearths whose smoke curled up into the rafters, blackening the ceiling with years of culinary soot. Beds were placed close together around the fire, and furs, glorious, thick, possibly still warm furs, were layered like lasagna. Viking winter fashion wasn't far off from Viking winter bedding. It wasn't just people trying to stay warm. It was architecture, clothing, family customs. The warmth of winter was manifold. The heat of fire, the breath of a nearby sleeper, the muffled soundscape of snow-padded roofs. Being warm was being clever, prepared, and often very close to a pig. As night drew on and frost traced lacy scrolls across window panes, people huddled under wool, muslin, fur, and that peculiar type of contentment that comes when toes are finally blessedly warm. The stillness of winter sleeps echoed through centuries, broken only by the pop of a coal or the soft, sleepy shuffle of someone repositioning their elbows into the cozier part of the blanket. And as the fire gently dimmed to embers and sleep swept through the longhouses, beds, and kotatsus of the past, another kind of warmth sparked, the warmth of dreams and the curious comfort of inventiveness in the face of cold. Soon enough, in another nook of time, they would need to eat again, even in the snow. Somewhere in the frostbitten stillness of the northern European countryside, as the wind flirted with frozen thatch and the trees creaked with the solemn wisdom of old bark and older winters, villagers huddled indoors, armed with wool, onions, and an indomitable will to keep warm and mildly entertained. In this chapter of humanity's ongoing struggle with January and its lifelong feud with central heating, allow me to introduce you to one of winter's most unlikely heroes, the humble bed warmer. Picture a pewter pan on a long wooden handle, looking a little like a medieval frying pan that gave up on cooking and went into retirement. It would be filled with glowing embers or preheated stones, and then, gingerly, with both reverence and the absolute terror of setting your linen on fire, slipped between the sheets to warm the bed. This was often the job of a child, a servant, or someone the family liked, but not enough to worry if they got singed. But let us not pretend that was the only method of surviving a frigid night. No. Bedrooms were battlegrounds, quaint, candlelit battlegrounds, where humanity tested how many layers of wool it could add before becoming a sentient ball of yarn. And so, beds became bunkers. The wealthier folk in medieval and early modern Europe slept in what were essentially wooden wardrobes with mattresses inside, known coyly as enclosed beds. These cozy contraptions had doors, curtains, and in some cases, the architectural ambition of a tool shed. Inside it was warmer, darker, and, if you had the right kind of hay for stuffing, possibly less lumpy. In the colder corners of the world like Scandinavia, the bed was practically a family project. Multi-generational sleeping arrangements weren't just a reflection of familial closeness or a shortage of rooms. It was a thermal strategy. Grandparents, parents, and children often slept together like a fuzzy, snoring lasagna. Once everyone was cocooned under shared blankets and fox furs, it wasn't exactly luxurious, but it was effective. Think of it less like a sleepover and more like a group hug sponsored by survivalism. Even sleep itself, during the bleak midwinter, took on intriguing forms. In many pre-industrial societies, nighttime wasn't one long nap, so much as 2 naps with a midnight snack in between. This practice, known by historians as segmented sleep, seemed entirely normal to the people doing it. Folks would go to bed shortly after nightfall, sleep for a few hours, then wake in the dead of night to pray, ponder, or perhaps poke the fire and gossip with the cat. After this interlude, known affectionately by modern scholars as the best part of the night to sneak a snack without judgment, people would drift back into their second sleep. The winters were long, the lighting dim, and candles expensive. So evening activities were quiet, knitting, whittling, recounting tales that blurred the line between folklore and someone's very suspicious dream. In some places, people even sang quietly to themselves as they prepared for bed. These gentle winter lullabies were less about performance and more about rhythm, cadences to nudge the mind away from the cold outside and toward the cozy inside. Inside minds, inside blankets, inside dreams. Now, if you happen to live in a castle rather than a croft, well, congratulations. But winter wasn't done with you. Stone walls do not insulation make. So tapestries were hung not just for aesthetic grandeur, but as literal wall blankets. You might find yourself sleeping in a massive canopied bed capable of hosting a diplomatic summit, adorned with heavy velvets layered atop heavier woolens. Even royalty knew that when it came to winter nights, fashion bowed humbly before warmth. And should all else fail, there was always the oldest method in the human arsenal: complaining. Letters from the past are filled with moody dispatches about the cruel winds, the sullen fires, and the epic betrayal of socks. Shakespeare himself wrote bitterly of the hoary-headed frosts and probably wore 3 pairs of trousers in December. Though in fairness, Elizabethan trousers were more suggestion than substance. So next time you snuggle under your duvet and debate whether walking 10 feet for another blanket is worth it, spare a humble thought for those who fought winter with boiling pans, group snoozes, segmented slumber, and bedtime monologues whispered to cracks in the wood. Soon, we'll tread softly into how food became warmth and kitchens surged to the center of winter life, one bubbling pot at a time. Every age has its winter dilemmas. For the Roman senator, it might have been whether the caldarium would be hot enough to soothe his joints. For a Viking, it was perhaps whether their longhouse neighbor had borrowed the last dry log. But for medieval monks tucked away in their stone-walled monasteries, their winter quandary was slightly different: how to stay warm without offending God, or the abbot. Picture the sprawling stone complex of a 12th century Benedictine monastery in the heart of winter. Snow falling gently like flour over a sieve, cloaking the fields in silence. Inside these chilly halls, monks shuffled in woolen robes and silence, bound by vows not only of poverty and celibacy, but sometimes, heartbreakingly, of sleep deprivation. You see, back then, sleep was a two-act play. Monastic schedules mirrored the divine rhythm, or at least tried to. Monks would go to bed early, often a few hours after sunset. But they weren't snoring straight through till morning. Oh no. Halfway through the night, the bells would toll like a frosty reminder of duty. It was time for vigils, also known as matins, the long and somewhat bleary-eyed service of psalms and prayer held in the cold chapel, usually around 2 or 3 a.m. Afterward, only the most fortunate and sly found their way back to bed for a second installment of sleep. And about those beds, monastic sleeping arrangements were spare. No feather mattresses or toasty warm duvets. A straw mattress at best, laid out atop a wooden board. Occasionally, a woolen blanket if you swore you'd memorize the Psalms of David. Heating, of course, was considered a spiritual luxury. Most monasteries didn't bother with fireplaces in dormitories. After all, suffering drew one closer to the divine, and hypothermia, apparently, did the same. To ward off the chill with minimal sin, monks layered undergarments of linen, robes of coarse, itchy wool, sandals that were practically metaphors for suffering when it came to tromping across snowflake cloisters. But even here, a touch of human mischief peeked through. Some monks smuggled heated stones under their robes, not exactly in the scripture, but certainly in the footnotes of survival. Speaking of stones, one of winter's cozy but lesser-known accomplices was the warming stone. Essentially, a chunk of rock heated in the kitchen hearth and then wrapped in cloth to serve as inefficient but comforting bed companions. It was the medieval equivalent of climbing into bed with a toaster oven. They were passed down like family heirlooms, and in particularly icy monasteries, considered more sacred than relics of saints. Well, at least until they cooled, and one was left entertaining the theological question: if a stone loses its heat in the night, did it ever truly warm the soul? Meals too bore the chill. In winter, food was less about flavor and more about survival. Soups, potages, and stews were the go-to comfort foods of the day, slow-cooked in great cauldrons that doubled as heating sources. Monastic kitchens were among the few reliably warm spaces, so it's no small wonder some chores took mysteriously long to finish, like stirring porridge for 14 hours straight. But even as monks braved the cold on an indigent diet of legumes and barley, they had one secret weapon: communal habits. Sleeping side by side in a shared dormitory, each soul clutching their own warming stone or simply relying on the fraternal warmth of proximity, meant that together they kept out more chill than any fire could. And then there was the matter of shared silence. Odd as it sounds, speaking less might actually keep you warmer. Every word you breathe out is a puff of warm air, lost forever. Better to save it for chanting psalms or muttering prayers through clenched teeth as your toes slowly turned into icicles beneath your robe. Despite the hardships, or perhaps because of them, monks had a unique relationship with winter. It was not a thing to be conquered, but endured with grace. Cold wasn't the enemy, just another sensation on the path to holiness. They wrapped themselves in layers of both wool and wisdom, knowing that spring and salvation would eventually thaw everything. And as those stone corridors cooled even further towards dawn, the monks bowed their tonsured heads beside flickering candlelight, their breath clouding in the air like incense. Not complaining, not even flinching, just quietly counting the blessings of warmth wherever it could be found, even if it was just from a slightly less cold corner of the dormitory. Soon, the world outside the monastery will begin to stir as winter slowly releases its grip, and in another corner of the ancient world, warmth will be layered not in wool, but in song, stories, and smoky hearths. As the winter deepened and the frost took on that shimmering, silvery authority that only deep December can muster, people in the past resorted to some, shall we say, time-honored methods for simply making it through the night with all 10 toes intact. You see, the modern creature comforts of central heating and fuzzy socks, the thickness of a suburban blanket didn't exist for much of human history. And so, people got creative, or at very least, desperate. Let's begin with the most unlikely of allies in the war against Jack Frost: sheep. In medieval Europe, your average peasant didn't just own sheep for wool. No, sometimes the sheep were the wool. Particularly during the grimmer phases of winter, it was entirely normal to find livestock sleeping in the home. The family might be shivering on their straw-stuffed mattress, while Bessie, the cow, gave off a gentle warmth nearby, just chewing her cud and dreaming bovine dreams. Pigs, for their part, were the portable foot warmers of the time. Squealing, snorting, less than hygienic foot warmers, but effective nonetheless. And before you shudder in modern horror, consider this. If your options are between hypothermia and a shared bed with a barnyard cast, well, let's just say you'd thank the pig and maybe knit it a tiny sweater. Fireplaces, the proud kings of the medieval home, were notoriously inefficient, about as good at heating a room as trying to boil a cauldron with a candle. Most of the warmth escaped up the chimney, along with a hearty chunk of smoke and the occasional startled bird. If you were wealthy enough, you might have had a canopy bed with heavy drapes, forming a sort of cozy tent. You and the warmth could huddle in together like two secret lovers hiding from the cold. The poorer crowd, meanwhile, had to content themselves with bedfellows, an innocent term most of the time, referring to the fact that 2 or more people, often strangers, might bed down together purely for warmth, a sort of social hot water bottle arrangement. Boundaries weren't a high priority when your teeth chattered in Morse code through the night. Speaking of hot water, the invention of the bed warmer was a game changer. This little contraption was essentially a metal pan filled with hot coals, tucked strategically under the bed covers before sleep. Of course, it was also an excellent way to burn down your house while trying not to freeze to death, a sort of domestic Russian roulette. But hey, what's a little risk when frostbite's knocking at your door? In 17th century France, some clever soul came up with the idea of the chaufferette, a small portable box of embers you could place under your skirts while seated. It was warmth for your lower half, and occasionally, if balance failed you, a quite literal fire hazard. This, my friends, is why no one napped in chairs back then. You close your eyes for 1 second, and suddenly, there's a flaming petticoat involved. The past, truly, never ran out of dramatic flair. Nap scheduling also played its part. Many people, especially in the colder northern latitudes, practiced segmented sleep, dozing in 2 stretches through the night with a wakeful hour or 2 in between. This was not, as we might think, a cursed result of poor sleep hygiene, but a soothing, built-in break, used for stoking the fire, visiting neighbors, or whispering secrets. There's something oddly romantic about it, really. Imagine yawning quietly in the glow of the hearth, wrapped in a woolen shawl and a moment of silence. while the snowdreams drift past your window. Some even use that middle-of-the-night intermission as a natural time to pray, meditate, or go check on the pigs. Ah yes, back to the pigs again. In colder Asian regions, more innovative, deeply clever solutions arose. In Korea, the ondol heating system revolutionized home heating entirely. A system of hot air and smoke from the kitchen traveling beneath the floors made the entire house cozier than any single hearth could manage. People curled up on toasty floor mats with a kind of smug radiance that only radiant floor heating can provide. They were, in effect, the first society to discover that sleeping directly on a warm floor feels suspiciously like winning. But perhaps the most striking thing about all these efforts to stay warm isn't the ingenuity itself. It's the sense of shared experience, that across time and geography, humans have crouched closer to the fire, murmured together under thick blankets, endured odd bedmates and chilly winds, and made it, somehow, through the long, frozen silence of ancient winters. And just beyond that silence, something stirs, a flicker of light, not from fire, not from stars, but from the future. A glimmer of how it all began to change. Let's drift there next. In the hush of an ancient winter night, where the stars blinked like tired embers overhead, and the wind sighed secrets through cracks in wattle and daub, something quite poignant stirred beneath the patchwork hides and hearth-baked stones. The world, despite its frost, had survived the day, and so families huddled close for warmth, not just physical, but the warming camaraderie of breath and elbows and whispered tales shared in the flickering firelight. You see, ancient winters didn't come with central heating, nor did they feature knitwear labeled extra cozy. They were raw, wild things. They nipped at ankles, frosted beards into icicles, and made the simple act of staying alive a subtle art and something of an ongoing group project. In hut, hall, longhouse, or cave, the cold drew people nearer to each other and to the fire. The great equalizer, it made companions of chieftains and chickens alike. Even mighty Roman villas, luxurious by ancient standards, had their own chilly corners. The famed Hippocos system, a marvel of early engineering that warmed Roman floors from below, still left bedrooms unheated, because the Romans apparently believed that sleeping too warm would invite illness, a theory that would deeply confuse the modern blanket burrito. But when the coals were low and the woolen socks non-existent, staying warm meant something more primitive and more poetic. In Japan's Edo period, families might gather around the kotatsu, a low wooden table with a blanket draped over it and a heat source underneath, like a charcoal brazier. To this day, it's difficult to tell where the kotatsu ends and a nap begins. Snoozing grandfather, warming toes, or a family cat achieving nirvana. Hard to say. In medieval Europe, bedrooms were often shared by the many, the mighty, and the mouse-like. Couples, children, servants, sometimes even guests, all heaped together in great beds, pillow to foot, cousin to cobbler. The phrase "sleep tight" emerges from this world, where bed frames were woven with ropes that needed regular tightening, lest you slowly sink during the night like a weary souffle. And blankets. The layering ritual. Furs of fox and bear, sheepskin, or anything willing to be both fluffy and deceased found themselves enlisted. The wealthier stretched for imported wool. The poor, they often doubled up everything else: socks, cloaks, and dignity. There's even record of medieval monks sleeping in their habits, not out of piety, but because taking them off meant braving cold stone floors. The Lord understands. People also timed their slumber to the rhythm of light and season. a natural kind of calendar kept by fire and eyelid. In many cultures, a two-phase sleep cycle was common. A first sleep after dusk, followed by a period of wakefulness, a nocturnal interlude filled with quiet thought, prayer, or depending on whom you ask, inconspicuous cuddling, before drifting into a second sleep until dawn. The darkness was not feared so much as respected, a time less for action than reflection. Food, too, played its part in keeping folks warm long after kitchens quieted for the night. Thick stews, rich in fats and root vegetables, supplied not only sustenance, but slow-burning internal insulation. A warm porridge before bed was more than a comfort. It was your final defense against the creeping draft. In parts of the Nordic world, if someone passed gas under the furs, it was considered a communal victory. Warming duties came in many forms, and so, as winter roared outside, whether across the vast steppe or within the stone-walled courtyard of a feudal manor, people met its challenge the way humans always had, inventively, clumsily, and together. They stacked logs and stories, bundled themselves in wool and wonder, and made the long night gentler by sheer force of each other. The world may have been colder then, but it pulsed with a fire that came from within, from crackling laughter, shared bread, and the inexplicable coziness of socks before socks were even invented. And now, as the fire shrinks to embers in your mind, and the last page of our sleepy history turns invisible in the dark, let yourself settle into your own nest, modern and warm. Think of those who once dreamed here before us, beneath beams and stars, breathing calm into the cold. The past has quieted, and now, so may you. Good night.